Jake had been fixing military equipment for almost 10 years now. He thought he had seen everything that could break, bend, or blow up. But when the transport truck pulled up to his workshop that Tuesday morning, he knew this was going to be different. The guards were more serious than usual. They didn't joke around or ask about his weekend plans like they normally did. Instead, they just wheeled in a large metal container and left without saying much. The paperwork was stamped with red letters that said classified all over it. When Jake opened the container, his jaw dropped. Inside was the most beautiful piece of armor he had ever seen. It was black as midnight, but when the light hit it just right, it seemed to shimmer with deep purple colors. The metal looked smooth, almost like it was alive somehow. He had never seen anything like it before. This wasn't human-made armor. This belonged to one of those alien warriors he had heard about on the news. The Catherians, they called them. Earth had made friends with them a few months ago when the war against those bad guys from space got really serious. Jake whistled softly as he looked at the damage. Deep cuts ran across the chest and arms of the armor. But these weren't normal cuts. They seemed to glow with a soft light, and he could swear he felt warmth coming from them. This was definitely not like fixing a broken radio or a tank engine. About an hour later, she walked in. Jake had seen pictures of Catherians on TV, but seeing one in person was completely different. She was tall, really tall, probably 7 feet. Her skin had a silver color to it, and her eyes were golden like honey. She moved with the kind of grace that made you think of a big cat, powerful but smooth. "You are Jake, the repair specialist," she said. Her voice was deep and had an accent he couldn't place. She wasn't asking, she was stating a fact. "Yes, that's me," Jake replied, trying not to stare. "And you must be the owner of this amazing armor." "I am Kira," she said simply. "Your people say you are the best at fixing things. My armor needs your skills." Jake nodded and walked over to the damaged equipment. "I can see that. These cuts look pretty deep. What happened out there?" Kira's expression got darker. "Battle with the enemy. They have new weapons that can cut through our defenses. This armor has protected me for many years, but even it has limits." As Jake started to examine the armor more closely, he noticed something strange. Every time his fingers touched the surface, even lightly, Kira would tense up. Her breathing would change, getting a little faster. At first, he thought maybe she was worried about him damaging it further. "Don't worry," Jake said gently, running his hand along one of the damaged sections. "I'll be very careful. I know this must be expensive to replace." Kira made a small sound, almost like she was holding her breath. Jake looked up at her with concern. "Am I hurting it somehow? I'm barely touching it." "No," Kira said quickly, but her voice sounded strained. "Continue with your work." Jake went back to his examination, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time he had to touch a different part of the armor, Kira would react. Her hands would clench into fists, or she would shift from foot to foot. Her golden eyes never left his hands. The armor was unlike anything in his textbooks. It seemed to be made from some kind of living metal that responded to touch and temperature. When Jake pressed his palm against it, the surface would warm up slightly. When he traced along the edges of the damage with his finger, the cuts would pulse with that strange purple light. "This is incredible technology," Jake said, genuinely amazed. "It's almost like the armor is alive. How does it work exactly?" Kira was quiet for a long moment. She seemed to be struggling with something internal. "Catherian armor is not like your human equipment," she finally said. "It is grown, not built. It becomes part of the warrior who wears it." "Part of you? Like, connected somehow?" "Yes," Kira said, but she didn't explain further. Jake continued his work, taking notes and photographs of the damage patterns. He would need to understand the armor's structure before he could figure out how to repair it properly. But the more he touched it, the more agitated Kira seemed to become. By the end of the first day, Jake had mapped out most of the damage, but he still didn't understand why Kira was acting so strangely. She had barely moved from her spot across the workshop, but she watched every single movement he made with intense focus. "I'll need a few more days to fully understand how to fix this," Jake told her as he cleaned his tools. The damage is complex and I want to make sure I don't make things worse. Kira nodded stiffly. I will return tomorrow. As she walked toward the door, Jake called out, Kira, is everything okay? You seem uncomfortable. If you don't trust me, with your armor I can recommend someone else. She stopped and turned back to him. For a moment her tough warrior expression softened, and Jake saw something that looked almost like confusion in her golden eyes. It is not about trust, she said, quietly. You are very skilled. Continue tomorrow. After she left, Jake stood in his workshop surrounded by his tools and notes, feeling like he was missing something important. The armor sat on his workbench, still glowing softly in the dim light. He had the strangest feeling that fixing this equipment was going to be more complicated than just welding metal and replacing parts. What he didn't know was that Catherian armor wasn't just protective gear. It was connected directly to the nervous system of whoever wore it. Every careful, gentle touch he had been making to examine the damage had been transmitted directly to Kira's body as physical sensation. And Jake's soft, methodical approach to his work was driving the warrior absolutely crazy in ways she had never experienced before. The next morning, Jake arrived at his workshop early. He had spent most of the night thinking about Kira's armor and her strange reactions. He'd even done some research online about Catherian technology, but there wasn't much information available to regular people like him. When Kira arrived, she looked tired. There were dark circles under her golden eyes, and she seemed more on edge than the day before. She took her usual spot across the workshop and watched as Jake began his work. Jake had decided to be extra careful today. If his touching the armor was somehow painful for her, he would be even more gentle. He started working on the chest piece, barely letting his fingertips brush against the surface as he examined the damage. The result was immediate. Kira's breathing became uneven, and her hands gripped the edge of the table she was leaning against. Jake noticed purple veins starting to glow faintly under her silver skin, something he hadn't seen before. Are you feeling sick? Jake asked, looking up from his work. You look like you're in pain. I am fine, Kira said through gritted teeth. Continue your work. But she didn't look fine at all. As Jake continued his gentle examination, tracing the damaged areas with the lightest possible touch, Kira's condition seemed to get worse. She started pacing back and forth across the workshop, her movements sharp and agitated. By the second day, Jake was completely confused. He had started working even more carefully, thinking that somehow he was still being too rough. When he had to examine the areas around what would be the waist and sides of the armor, Kira would actually leave the workshop for several minutes at a time. Maybe I should use tools instead of my hands, Jake suggested when she returned from one of her breaks. I don't want to cause you any discomfort. Kira stopped pacing and stared at him. Tools? Yeah, instruments to examine the damage instead of touching it directly. That way, if I'm somehow hurting you, it won't happen anymore. Something flashed in Kira's golden eyes. It looked almost like frustration, but Jake couldn't understand why she would be frustrated with his offer to help. No tools, she said firmly. Use your hands. It is the proper way. Jake was getting more confused by the minute, but he went back to work. He tried to be even more gentle than before, barely making contact with the armor's surface. This seemed to make things worse. Kira's pacing became more intense, and she started making small sounds under her breath that sounded like she was trying not to say something. On the third day, Jake was working on a particularly damaged section near the shoulder area. He was being so careful that he was barely touching the armor at all, just letting his fingers hover over the surface while he studied the damage pattern. Suddenly, Kira was standing right behind him. Jake hadn't even heard her move. When he turned around, she was towering over him, her golden eyes blazing with an emotion he couldn't identify. Her face was flushed, and those purple veins under her skin were glowing brighter than he had ever seen them. Human Jake, she said, her voice deeper and more intense than usual. I must tell you something. Jake set down his tools and turned to face her completely. Okay, what is it? Kira seemed to struggle with her words for a moment. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. You have been touching me for 3 days, she said finally. Touching your armor, yes, Jake replied, still not understanding. I'm trying to be as gentle as possible so I don't hurt you. That is the problem, Kira said, her voice getting stronger. You are touching me too softly. The words hung in the air between them. Jake blinked, trying to process what she had just said. What? Too softly? I don't understand. Kira took a deep breath, and Jake could see her making some kind of internal decision. The armor is not separate from me, she said slowly. When you touch the armor, you are touching me. Every movement of your hands, I feel it. For 3 days you have been, she paused, searching for the right words, caressing me with the gentleness one would use with a lover. But then you pull away as if you are afraid. Jake's eyes went wide as the meaning of her words sank in. Oh no. Oh, I had no idea. I thought I was just being careful with expensive equipment. Cytherian armor bonds with our nervous system, Kira explained, her cheeks taking on a darker silver color that Jake realized might be the equivalent of blushing. When someone touches our armor, we feel it as if they were touching our bare skin. It is why we do not allow strangers to handle our equipment. Jake felt his face getting hot with embarrassment. But then why did you ask me to repair it? If it's that personal, surely there must be Cytherian specialists who could fix it. There are, Kira admitted. But Cytherian repairs are rough and quick. Your people have a reputation for precision and care. I thought, she trailed off, looking uncertain for the first time since Jake had met her. You thought what? I thought I could handle it. I have been watching you work for many months on other projects. Your skill impressed me. I did not expect the feelings that your touch would create. Jake ran his hands through his hair, trying to process this information. So when I was trying to be extra gentle because I thought I was hurting you, I was actually making it more difficult for me to control my responses, yes. They stood there in awkward silence for a moment. Jake's mind was racing. He had been inadvertently creating an intensely personal situation without even knowing it. I can transfer this job to someone else, Jake offered. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. No, Kira said quickly. In my culture, once the bonding process has begun, changing hands would be seen as a grave insult. We must finish what we started. Jake looked at the armor, then back at Kira. So, what do we do? How do I fix this properly without making things weird between us? Kira's expression softened slightly. In Cytherian culture, we value directness and confidence. Your gentleness, while well-intentioned, feels like hesitation to me. If you work with more confidence, with the respect that skilled craftsmanship deserves, it will be easier for both of us. Jake nodded slowly. So less tiptoeing around and more professional confidence? Yes, Kira said. And for the first time in 3 days, she looked relieved. Work as you would on any important project. Trust your skills. As Jake picked up his tools again, he realized that this job had become much more complicated than just fixing damaged equipment. But looking at Kira, seeing the trust in her golden eyes despite the awkward situation they had stumbled into, he found himself more determined than ever to do right by her. After their conversation, everything changed between Jake and Kira. The awkward tension from the past 3 days had been replaced by a different kind of awareness. Now that Jake understood what was really happening, he found himself much more conscious of every movement he made. The first time he touched the armor with his new understanding, he worked with steady, confident movements. Instead of the feather-light touches he had been using before, he pressed his palms firmly against the damaged sections, examining them with the same professional confidence he would use on any important repair job. The change in Kira was immediate. Her breathing became normal again, and the tight expression she had been wearing for days finally relaxed. She stopped pacing and actually sat down for the first time since arriving at his workshop. Better? Jake asked, glancing up from his work. Much better, Kira replied, and Jake could hear relief in her voice. This is how it should be. But even though the immediate crisis was over, Jake found himself curious about the warrior sitting across from him. During their work breaks, he started asking questions about her culture and her experiences as a soldier. So you've been fighting in this war for a long time? Jake asked during lunch on the fourth day. Kira nodded, unwrapping what looked like some kind of protein bar that definitely wasn't made on Earth. 7 years now, since the Void Syndicate first attacked the outer colonies. That must be tough, Jake said, being away from home so much. Home is wherever the battle needs me to be, Kira replied, but Jake noticed something sad in her voice when she said it. As the days passed, Jake learned more about Catherian society. They were a warrior culture, but not in the way humans usually thought of warriors. They valued protection above conquest, skill above strength, and honor above personal gain. Your people have an interesting way of building relationships, Kira observed one afternoon as Jake worked on the intricate wiring systems inside her armor. Humans seem to start with emotions and then build trust. Catherians do it the opposite way. How do you mean? Jake asked, carefully connecting two biometallic cables. We start with trust, with proving our capabilities to each other. Emotions come later, if at all. She paused. It is why this situation has been so confusing for me. Jake looked up from his work. Confusing how? Kira seemed to consider her words carefully. Among my people, allowing someone to touch your armor is reserved for family or, she trailed off. Or, life partners, she finished quietly. Jake's hands stilled on the armor. Oh, so when you asked me to repair this, you were basically offering you the highest level of trust my culture recognizes, yes. I did not expect it to affect me the way it has. They worked in thoughtful silence for a while after that. Jake found himself stealing glances at Kira when she wasn't looking. She really was magnificent, he realized. Not just because she was tall and strong and obviously skilled in combat, but because of the way she carried herself. There was a dignity to her, a sense of purpose that Jake found himself admiring. Can I ask you something? Jake said as he tested the armor's power systems. Of course. Why did you really choose me for this job? I mean, if it's such a personal thing in your culture, you must have had a reason. Kira was quiet for so long that Jake thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than usual. I have been stationed on this base for 4 months. I have watched many of your people work. Most humans approach their tasks with impatience. They want to finish quickly and move on to the next thing. She looked directly at Jake. But you are different. You take time with your work. You care about doing it correctly, even when no one is watching. Jake felt his cheeks getting warm. I just think if something's worth doing, it's worth doing right. Yes, Kira said, a small smile crossing her face. That is exactly what I mean. That kind of care, that respect for craftsmanship, it is valued highly in my culture. As Jake continued working, he realized he was starting to see Kira differently too. At first she had just been this intimidating alien warrior who had brought him an interesting challenge. But now he was seeing the person underneath all that armor. She was thoughtful, intelligent, and despite her tough exterior, there was something almost vulnerable about the way she had trusted him with something so personal to her people. What will happen when the armor is finished? Jake asked on the 6th day. I will return to active duty, Kira replied. There are rumors of a major offensive being planned. My unit will likely be deployed within days of my return. The thought of her going back into danger bothered Jake more than he expected it to. He had gotten used to having her around, used to their conversations and her quiet presence in his workshop. Do you ever get leave time off from fighting? Kira tilted her head, studying his face. Sometimes. Why do you ask? Jake felt nervous suddenly, like he was about to say something that might change everything between them. I was thinking maybe when you get some time off you could come back here. Not for repairs or anything official, just to visit. The silence stretched between them. Jake immediately started worrying that he had overstepped some cultural boundary. He didn't understand. You would want that? Kira asked finally. Yeah, Jake said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. I would. Kira stood up and walked over to where Jake was working. For a moment she just looked down at him, her golden eyes unreadable. "My people do not form casual friendships with other species," she said carefully. "When we choose to spend time with someone, it means something significant." Jake met her gaze. "Maybe that's okay with me." Something shifted in Kira's expression. The warrior mask she usually wore seemed to slip slightly, revealing something warmer underneath. "There is something you should know," she said. "The reason I have been watching you work for months, the reason I chose you specifically for this task, it was not only because of your skill." "What do you mean?" Kira seemed to struggle with the words. "In my observation of humans, I have found most of your people to be loud, rushed, and careless with things that matter. But you are different. You work with your hands the way a Catherian warrior moves in battle, with purpose, precision, and respect for what you are doing." She paused. "I found myself drawn to that quality." Jake felt his heart speed up. "Drawn to it?" "Drawn to you," Kira clarified, her cheeks darkening with that silver blush again. The admission hung in the air between them. Jake realized that what had started as a simple repair job had become something much more complicated and much more meaningful than either of them had expected. Looking at Kira, seeing the uncertainty in her usually confident expression, Jake understood that they were both stepping into territory that neither of their cultures had prepared them for. Jake had just finished the most delicate part of the armor repair when the alarm started blaring. Red lights flashed throughout the workshop, and the automated voice system began announcing something that made his blood run cold. "Base security. Breach. All personnel report to emergency stations. This is not a drill." Kira was on her feet instantly, her warrior instincts kicking in. But when she moved toward her armor, Jake could see the problem immediately. The repair work was about 70% complete, but the critical systems weren't fully integrated yet. "Don't even think about it," Jake said, stepping between Kira and her armor. "The power coupling isn't stable, and the defensive systems are still offline. You put that on right now, and you'll be going into battle with half your protection missing. I cannot stay here while my people fight," Kira said, her voice tight with frustration. "It is not who I am." Through the workshop windows, they could see soldiers running across the base courtyard. In the distance, explosions lit up the evening sky. Whatever was attacking them was big and organized. Jake's radio crackled to life. "All repair technicians to emergency stations. Bring portable equipment for field repairs. This is a priority 1 situation." "Field repairs," Jake muttered, then looked at Kira. "I have an idea. It's crazy, but it might work." "Tell me," Kira said immediately. "I can't finish the armor here, but I might be able to complete the repairs while you're wearing it. In the field during the battle." Jake started gathering his portable tools. "The risk is that if I mess up while the systems are active, it could seriously hurt you." Kira didn't hesitate. "Do it." "Kira, you need to understand what you're agreeing to. I'll literally be working on live systems while they're connected to your nervous system. One wrong move, and I could overload your entire sensory network. I trust you," she said simply. And those 3 words hit Jake harder than he expected. Within minutes, they were moving through the base corridors. Kira had put on her partially repaired armor, and Jake could see her wincing every few steps as the incomplete system sent confusing signals to her body. He carried his emergency repair kit and tried to keep up with her long strides. The attack was worse than they had first thought. The Void Syndicate had somehow gotten past the base's outer defenses and were now fighting their way through the main compound. Jake could hear weapon fire echoing from multiple directions. "They knew exactly where to hit us," Kira observed as they moved. "Someone gave them detailed information about our defenses." They reached the main armory, where human soldiers were working alongside Catherian warriors to hold a defensive position. Jake immediately spotted the problem. The enemy had some kind of new weapon that was cutting through both human and Catherian equipment, like it was made of paper. "Commander!" Kira called out to a tall Catherian male who was coordinating the defense. "Kira, thank the ancestors, we need you on the front line. The enemy has breached sectors 3 and 7. My armor is not fully functional, Kira reported, but my repair specialist believes he can complete the work during combat. The commander looked at Jake with surprise. A human during battle? He has earned my trust, Kira said firmly, and Jake felt a surge of pride at her words. The commander nodded. Then go. We need every warrior we can get. As they moved toward the heaviest fighting, Jake realized he was more scared than he had ever been in his life. But looking at Kira, seeing the determination in her golden eyes even though he knew she was in pain from her malfunctioning armor, he found his courage. The first time Jake had to work on her armor during actual combat was terrifying. They had taken cover behind an overturned vehicle while enemy fire rained down around them. Kira's left arm systems had started failing completely, and she couldn't use her weapon properly. I need 30 seconds, Jake shouted over the noise of battle. You have it, Kira replied, then stood up and began returning fire with her good arm, drawing the enemy's attention away from Jake. Jake's hands moved with practiced efficiency, connecting the loose power cables in her arm while energy blasts exploded just meters away from them. This wasn't like working in his quiet workshop. This was fast, dangerous, and there was no room for mistakes. Done, Jake called out, and immediately he could see the difference in Kira's movements. Her left arm was working again, and she began fighting with the deadly grace he had only heard stories about. They moved through the base together, Jake providing emergency repairs whenever Kira's incomplete systems started failing. It was the strangest partnership he could have imagined. A human repair technician and an alien warrior working as a team in the middle of a battle. But it worked. More than that, it worked perfectly. Jake learned to anticipate what Kira needed, before she even asked for it. When her targeting system started glitching during a firefight, he was already reaching for the right tools. When her armor's power distribution became uneven, he had the fix ready. And Kira, despite her own battle focus, never forgot to protect Jake. She positioned herself so that he was always shielded from the worst of the fighting. When enemy soldiers got too close, she would eliminate the threat before Jake even knew it was there. Behind you, Jake shouted at one point, spotting movement over Kira's shoulder while he was working on her backplate systems. Kira spun and fired in one smooth motion, taking down an enemy soldier who had been about to attack them both. Good eyes, she said simply, then held still while Jake finished his repair work. The strangest part was that Jake found himself less afraid as the battle went on. Working with Kira, seeing how she trusted him completely even in the most dangerous moments, gave him confidence he didn't know he had. His hands were steady, his movements were sure, and his repairs were perfect even under pressure. When they finally reached the main battle zone, Jake could see why they had needed Kira so desperately. The enemy's new weapons were devastating. The defensive lines and morale was low. But then Kira stepped into the fight, her armor now functioning at 90% capacity thanks to Jake's field repairs. She moved like a force of nature, her weapon systems working perfectly, her defensive capabilities restored. The change in the battle was immediate. How did you do it? Another human technician asked Jake as they watched Kira lead a counterattack that began pushing the enemy back. Teamwork, Jake replied, never taking his eyes off the warrior who had trusted him with her life. By the time the battle was over, Jake had learned something about himself he never would have discovered sitting safely in his workshop. He was braver than he thought, more skilled under pressure than he had imagined, and apparently, he was the kind of person that a Catherian warrior could depend on when everything was on the line. As they walked back through the now quiet base, Kira's armor systems finally stable and fully functional, she stopped and turned to face him. What you did today, she said quietly. No one from my world has ever experienced anything like it. To have someone watch your back, to trust someone that completely while fighting for your life, it changes something inside you. Jake nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. It changes something in both people, I think. 3 days after the battle, Jake was back in his workshop putting the finishing touches on Kira's armor. The field repairs had held up perfectly during the fighting, but now he could take the time to do everything properly. Every system was running better than new. Every connection was perfect, and the armor looked absolutely magnificent. But Jake found himself working slower than usual. Once he finished, Kira would leave. Her unit had received new orders to deploy to a system called Kepler 442, where intelligence suggested the Void Syndicate was planning something big. It would be at least 6 months before she might return to Earth, and there was no guarantee she would be assigned to the same base when she did. "You are stalling," Kira observed from her usual spot across the workshop. Jake looked up from the chest piece he had been polishing for the 3rd time, maybe a little. Why? The question was simple, but Jake found it hard to answer. How do you explain to someone that they've become important to you in just a couple of weeks? How do you tell an alien warrior that the thought of them going back into danger makes your chest feel tight? "I guess I'm going to miss having you around," Jake said finally. Kira was quiet for a moment. "I have been thinking about our conversation the other day," she said, "about forming connections across species." "Yeah? It is more complicated than I first realized." Kira stood and walked over to examine her armor. In Catherian culture, when two people go through what we experienced during the battle, when they trust each other that completely, it creates a bond that is considered sacred. Jake set down his polishing cloth. "What kind of bond?" "The closest translation in your language would be battle partners. It means two people who have proven they can depend on each other when life and death are on the line." Kira traced one of the repaired sections with her finger. "Among my people, such bonds are rare and precious. They often last a lifetime." "And with humans?" "I do not know," Kira admitted. "This is the first time a Catherian has formed such a bond with someone from another species." Jake thought about the battle, about the way they had worked together as if they had been a team for years instead of days. He remembered the absolute trust in Kira's eyes when she let him work on her armor while energy blasts were exploding around them. "I know I've never felt anything like it," Jake said honestly. "Having someone trust me that completely, and trusting them the same way. It changes you." "Yes," Kira said softly. "It does." Over the next day, as Jake completed the final adjustments to her armor, they talked about what would happen next. Kira explained more about her culture and her duties as a warrior. Jake told her about his life, his work, and his dreams of maybe someday designing new equipment instead of just repairing old stuff. "You should do that," Kira said when he mentioned his design ideas. "The improvements you made to my armor during our field repairs, they are better than the original specifications. You have the mind of an inventor, not just a repair technician." "Maybe someday," Jake replied. "Right now there's a war going on. People need their equipment fixed more than they need new inventions." "The war will not last forever," Kira said, "and when it ends, the galaxy will need people who can build bridges between different worlds. People like you, who can understand both the technology and the beings who use it." On her last evening at the base, Kira made a request that surprised Jake. "I want you to teach me about human customs," she said. "If we are going to maintain our connection across the distance, I should understand your people better." So Jake found himself explaining human holidays, human food, human entertainment, and human relationships. Kira listened with the same intense focus she brought to everything else, asking thoughtful questions and making observations that often made Jake see his own culture in new ways. Humans seem to place great importance on physical touch as a way of showing affection, Kira observed. "Yeah, I guess we do," Jake replied. "Hugs, handshakes, that kind of thing." "Why?" "Catherians are not a physically affectionate species, except in very specific circumstances, but I find myself wondering what human expressions of affection would feel like." The comment hung in the air between them. Jake looked at Kira, this magnificent warrior who had somehow become so important to him, and made a decision. "Would you like to find out?" he asked. Kira nodded, looking curious and slightly nervous. Jake stood up and walked over to her. "This is called a hug," he said softly. "It's what humans do when we care about someone and want them to know they're important to us." He wrapped his arms around her carefully, mindful of their size difference. For a moment, Kira stood stiffly, unsure of what to do. Then she relaxed and returned the embrace, her strong arms encircling him gently. They stood like that for a long moment, and Jake realized this was the first time they had touched when it wasn't related to her armor. This was just them, two people who had found something special together despite coming from completely different worlds. "I understand now," Kira said quietly, not letting go. "This is very nice." The next morning, Jake helped load Kira's equipment onto the transport that would take her to the spaceport. Her armor was secured in its protective case, gleaming and perfect. Looking at it, Jake felt proud of the work he had done, but also sad that the project that had brought them together was finished. "I have something for you," Kira said, pulling a small device from her pack. "What is it?" "A communicator. It will allow us to send messages across interstellar distances. The signal may take weeks or months to reach its destination, but we will be able to stay in contact." Jake took the device, surprised by how much the gesture meant to him. "Thank you. I wasn't sure how we would stay connected," Kira finished. "Neither was I. But I realized that some bonds are too important to leave to chance." As the transport prepared to leave, Kira turned to Jake one last time. "When I return to Earth, and I will return, things may be different. The war may be over, our duties may have changed, but what we have created here, this understanding between us, it is strong enough to survive time and distance." "How can you be so sure?" Jake asked. Kira smiled, and it transformed her entire face. "Because it survived battle, and battle tests everything. If our bond can hold under those conditions, it can hold under any conditions." As Jake watched the transport disappear into the sky, he realized that Kira was right. What they had wasn't just a friendship or even just attraction. It was something deeper, something that had been forged under the most intense circumstances possible. He looked down at the communicator in his hands and made himself a promise. He would stay in touch, he would wait for her return, and he would use the time they were apart to become the kind of person who deserved a bond with someone as remarkable as Kira. 6 months felt like a long time, but Jake had learned something important during their time together. The best things in life, the things that really matter, are worth waiting for, and Kira was definitely worth waiting for.